It was the kind of street where nothing ever happened. A row of modest, well-kept homes framed by trimmed hedges and porch lights that burned until morning. The Harper home sat at the corner, its windows glowing warmly on that cool October night. Inside, 19-year-old Leah Morgan was settling into a routine she knew well. She had babysat for the Harpers many times before. She knew where the juice boxes were kept, which stuffed animal Eli refused to sleep without, and the exact lullabies his mother usually sang before bed. The night began like countless others. A simple dinner at the kitchen table, Eli giggling between mouthfuls of pasta, bath time filled with the sound of toy boats bumping along the water, and finally, the gentle quiet of bedtime stories beneath a soft nightlight. By 10:30 p.m., Leah sent a short text to Marissa Harper's phone. "All good. He's asleep." It was her usual check-in, something Marissa always appreciated when she and Daniel were out late. Leah placed her phone on the charger by the kitchen counter, poured herself a glass of water, and settled into the living room couch with a blanket. Outside, the neighborhood was silent. No cars passed, no dogs barked. There was nothing to indicate that in less than 90 minutes, something would fracture the quiet forever. At exactly midnight, Daniel eased their car into the driveway, headlights sweeping across the front lawn. Both parents were still laughing quietly about something from the evening as they walked to the front door. That laughter evaporated instantly when Daniel noticed the door wasn't latched. It hung slightly open, moving almost imperceptibly with the night air. Marissa stepped in first, calling for Leah in a low, concerned voice. There was no answer. The living room was empty, the blanket she'd left folded neatly on the couch. They moved through the house quickly, kitchen, hallway, guest bath, each room silent, untouched. When Marissa reached Eli's bedroom, she found him asleep, curled against his pillow, breathing softly. Relief was quickly replaced by confusion. Leah was nowhere in sight. The back door was locked, every window shut. No signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture or broken glass. Even Leah's handbag was still in the living room, zipped closed. On the counter, her phone glowed faintly on the charger. A single missed notification from earlier that evening. Daniel's voice was tight when he told Marissa to call the police. Within 15 minutes, the sound of sirens cut through the stillness, growing louder until flashing blue lights painted the quiet street. 2 patrol officers entered first, securing the scene while another went door to door, waking neighbors for statements. Nobody had seen Leah leave. Nobody had heard a sound. The Harpers were ushered to the living room, where an officer began taking their account of the night, what Leah had been wearing when she'd last texted, who might have known she was babysitting. In the kitchen, another officer examined the phone, confirming it hadn't been touched since 10:30. A faint draft drifted through the open front door, but the doorknob showed no immediate signs of forced entry. A K-9 unit was deployed within the hour, the dogs tracing Leah's scent from the front porch down the short walkway, then stopping abruptly at the curb. It was as if she had vanished into the night mid-step. Neighbors stood clustered at their porches, arms crossed against the cold, watching as officers stretched yellow tape across Harper's lawn. The first whispers began then. Maybe she had gone for a walk, maybe she'd been picked up, maybe it was nothing. But inside, both the Harpers and the responding officers knew better. A teenage babysitter doesn't leave a sleeping 3-year-old unattended in the middle of the night, not without a reason, not without saying a word. By 2 a.m., the once quiet street had transformed. Marked units lined the curb, detectives spoke in hushed tones, and evidence techs moved through the house photographing each room. Eli remained asleep, a uniformed officer stationed quietly at his door. Marissa couldn't stop pacing, replaying every detail of the night, the text at 10:30, the open door, the stillness inside. Daniel sat rigid on the couch, answering questions mechanically but glancing toward the doorway as if expecting Leah to walk back in at any moment. When the lead detective arrived, he asked one question that made the air in the room shift. Who knew Leah would be here tonight? The Harpers exchanged a look. Babysitting wasn't a secret, but only a handful of people outside their family knew their schedule. As the officers kept working, that question lingered. Somewhere beyond the yellow tape, the night held an answer. But for now all they had was an open door, a missing girl, and a sleeping child who might have been the only witness. Within minutes of the first patrol units arriving, the Harper home became the center of a methodical, tightly controlled search. Officers moved quietly but with urgency, clearing each room, opening closets, checking under beds. Every movement was calculated. They were looking not just for Leah, but for anything. A misplaced shoe, a dropped piece of jewelry, a smudge on a doorframe that might tell them where she went. Nothing inside the house suggested violence. Nothing suggested panic. Yet her sudden absence was undeniable. The first officers on the scene began canvassing the street. Porch lights flickered on one by one as sleepy neighbors answered knocks at their doors. Each was asked the same questions. Did they see anyone? Hear anything unusual? Notice a vehicle parked where it didn't belong. Every response was some variation of no. A few had been asleep before 11, some had televisions on loud enough to mask outside noise. Not a single person could place Leah beyond 10:30 that night. It was as though the block had been swallowed by silence during the very hours she vanished. In the kitchen, the lead detective took special note of something small, but potentially telling. Leah's sneakers were missing. She had arrived wearing them. The Harpers remembered clearly. They weren't by the door, they weren't in the living room, and they weren't in her bag. It left two possibilities. She left willingly, or she left with someone who made her believe she'd be coming back. The second option was far more unsettling. When officers checked the back door, they found faint marks on the metal latch plate, the kind often left behind by a screwdriver or similar tool. They weren't deep or fresh enough to confirm a break-in that night, but they also weren't the kind of damage you'd expect in a home as well maintained as the Harpers. Daniel swore the back door had been secure when they left, locked like every other entrance. Whether the marks were new or months old was impossible to say without forensic analysis. Still, it was enough to raise the possibility that someone had entered without knocking. By now, it was after 1:30 in the morning, and the clock was working against them. Investigators knew that in missing persons cases, especially suspected abductions, the first few hours were critical. Every minute Leah was gone reduced the chances of finding her alive. The decision was made to expand the search outward. Officers radioed for additional units to block off both ends of the street. A search perimeter was drawn to include several surrounding blocks, alleys, and open spaces. A K-9 unit arrived, the dogs trained to pick up even faint human scent trails. One officer carefully handed over a hoodie Leah had worn earlier in the evening. The dogs sniffed, then pulled sharply toward the front walkway, noses low to the ground. They tracked the scent along the short path to the curb, and then stopped. No gradual fading, no weaving into a neighboring yard, just a clean break at the edge of the street, as if Leah had stepped off the curb and into a vehicle. The handler reported it without hesitation. The scent was gone. Daniel stood by the doorway, arms crossed tightly, watching every movement. Marissa paced, still in her evening dress, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. Both answered the detective's questions in short, clipped sentences. They repeated that Leah was reliable, that she had no known issues with anyone, no arguments or falling outs that they knew of. She wasn't the type to take risks. The Harpers had trusted her not just because she was responsible, but because she was protective of Eli. It made the idea of her stepping outside into the night without explanation feel impossible, unless something or someone made her. The search continued in widening circles until just before dawn. Officers swept through a nearby park, checked unlocked garages, and shone flashlights into storm drains. A drone was briefly deployed to scan the wooded area behind the neighborhood. Nothing. Every lead ended with the same blank stillness. By sunrise, the street was quiet again. Patrol cars remained parked along the curb, their lights now dark. The yellow tape was still strung across the Harper lawn, fluttering in the breeze. Inside, detectives were already drafting their first press statement. But the mood was grim. They had no suspect, no timeline beyond a 90-minute gap, and only one physical clue, the missing shoes, that might mean anything at all. And as the lead detective glanced once more at the curb where the dogs had stopped, he knew they were already behind. Whoever had taken Leah, or wherever she had gone, she was no longer here. At the precinct, Leah's phone became the first piece of evidence detectives tore apart. Every text, every call, every social media login was examined in chronological order, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, or a sudden shift in tone. The most recent messages, sent just before 10:34 p.m., were short and ordinary, one to her best friend saying she'd be home after babysitting. Another to Marissa Harper confirming Eli was asleep. There was nothing strange in her words, no hidden urgency, no hesitation. Her friend later told police Leah had sounded relaxed earlier that evening, even joking about being paid in leftover cookies. If Leah was afraid or planning something unusual, she hit it perfectly. Her social media activity told the same story. No posts, no story updates, no private messages after 10:34. The timestamp matched precisely with the last text to the Harpers, almost as if she had set her phone down for the night and never picked it up again. Detectives scrolled back weeks, then months. Leah had no history of late-night meetups, no sudden new contacts, and no encrypted apps hidden in plain sight, nothing that hinted at secret communications or a double life. With the digital trail providing so little, investigators turned to the physical world. They pulled security footage from every camera within a 4-block radius of the Harper home. Much of it was low quality, small convenience store feeds, outdated residential systems. Hours were spent watching the same uneventful stretches of sidewalk, the same passing cars. Leah never appeared on any clip leaving the house on foot. Then, on a feed from a corner hardware store, they found something worth a second look. The footage was time-stamped 11:02 p.m., less than 30 minutes before the Harpers returned home. A dark van, an older model, no visible markings, appeared in the frame and idled for nearly 3 minutes along the far curb of the block. Its windows were tinted, its license plate unreadable in the grainy resolution. The angle of the camera made it impossible to see if anyone got in or out. At 11:05, the van eased forward and disappeared out of frame. Detectives canvassed nearby streets again, asking if anyone recognized the vehicle. Some neighbors thought they'd seen a similar van before, maybe during the day, but no one could recall a specific date or driver. Vehicle registration searches turned up nothing useful. Too many matches for that make and color, too few concrete identifiers. The lead, promising at first, dissolved into uncertainty. Days passed, and with each one, the absence of new information deepened the sense of helplessness. Crime lab analysis of Leah's phone and the faint pry marks on the back door came back inconclusive. The shoes she had been wearing were still unaccounted for. No one reported seeing a girl matching her description walking the streets that night. There were no emergency calls from her number, no pings from her SIM card after she vanished. By the end of the first week, detectives had to admit they were stalling. Without evidence, they couldn't issue a warrant for any specific van. Without sightings, they couldn't even confirm she left the property willingly or was taken by force. Public tips slowed to a trickle. Leah's parents remained at the station every day, clutching copies of her senior photo, while the Harpers tried to keep the household from collapsing under the weight of suspicion and grief. The caseboard in the detective's bullpen showed the timeline of that night in a straight line. 10:30, Eli asleep. 10:34, last phone activity. 11:02, unidentified van. 12:01, parents return. 4 points. Everything else was empty space, a void that no one could explain. And in that silence, a reality began to settle among the investigators. Whatever happened to Leah, the answers were locked somewhere between that last text and the moment the Harpers walked through their front door. It was a gap that was shrinking in their minds, but expanding in the one place they feared most, the likelihood of ever finding her alive. In the days after Leah's disappearance, the investigation shifted from methodical searches to a storm of speculation that seemed to seep into every corner of the small community. With no arrests, no solid suspects, and no confirmed sightings, a vacuum formed, and people began filling it with their own theories. On the surface, the neighborhood kept its usual calm, but beneath that quiet, there were whispers. Some claimed Leah had been restless in recent months, that maybe she'd left voluntarily, chasing a sudden impulse or secret plan. One rumor painted a picture of a late-night rendezvous with a boyfriend no one had met, another of an impulsive decision to run away from her life altogether. None of it matched what her parents knew of her, but rumors didn't need to be true to spread. On the other side of the spectrum were the darker whispers, the kind that made parents clutch their children a little tighter at night. There had been a rash of break-ins in nearby suburbs, most occurring when residents were home asleep. In 2 of those cases, the intruder had fled without taking anything. The pattern was unsettling. No clear motive, no theft, just quiet entries and exits. Some began to wonder if Leah had stumbled onto one of these prowlers and paid the price. The theory gained traction when an older resident recalled hearing about a case years earlier involving a teenage babysitter attacked after confronting a burglar. It was enough to stir fear, but not enough to connect it to Leah's case in any provable way. Her parents fought against the narrative that she had chosen to disappear. They reminded anyone who would listen that Leah was deeply responsible, that she loved her work, and that she adored Eli. She wouldn't have left him alone in the middle of the night without telling anyone. Friends backed them up, recalling how Leah had once stayed late after a shift when Marissa was delayed, sitting quietly in the living room until she was sure Eli's parents were safely home. The picture they painted was of a young woman cautious by nature, not prone to risk, and certainly not someone who would vanish on a whim. For investigators, the absence of evidence was becoming as frustrating as the abundance of speculation. They considered every scenario they could put on paper. One theory was a burglary gone wrong, that someone entered the Harper home expecting it to be empty, panicked upon finding Leah inside, and forced her to leave. Another was a targeted abduction, that Leah herself had been the intended victim, not the household or its contents. And then there was the possibility that chilled the detectives the most. She might have known her abductor. It would explain the lack of forced entry, the absence of struggle, and perhaps why she left without her phone. Yet each possibility was undermined by the same problem. There was no physical evidence to anchor it, no fingerprints that didn't belong to the Harpers or Leah. No eyewitness to place a suspicious figure at the scene. The dark van spotted in grainy CCTV was promising for a time, but without a plate number or distinctive marks, it was just another shadow in the night. As the second week ended, the case began to slip from the headlines. The daily updates from the police chief became less frequent, replaced by brief mentions buried in the local paper. Search efforts dwindled as volunteers had to return to their jobs and routines. For Leah's family, the quiet was the hardest part. It felt like the world was moving on while they were still frozen on that night. For the investigators, the silence was no less cruel. They knew that the longer a case stayed unsolved, the colder it became, and that with every day that passed, the odds of finding Leah, alive or otherwise, grew smaller. But somewhere in the tangle of truth, rumor, and speculation, they still believed there had to be an answer. They just didn't know yet if it would come from a break in the case or from someone finally deciding to talk. In the days following Leah's disappearance, investigators held on to one lingering hope, that the only other person inside the house that night might have seen or heard something they could use. 3-year-old Eli Harper had been asleep when his parents returned, but children, even at that age, sometimes noticed things adults assumed they'd slept through. The challenge was that memories in someone so young were fragile, easily influenced, and often blurred by imagination. Detectives approached cautiously, speaking to Eli in gentle tones, avoiding leading questions. At first, he had nothing to offer. He played with his toys, asked when Leah was coming back, and became visibly quiet when the subject turned to the night she vanished. His calmness was strange, but not impossible to explain. Many children process distress through withdrawal rather than obvious fear. What unsettled investigators more was his avoidance, as though some part of him instinctively knew not to revisit those hours. When it became clear they wouldn't get more through standard questioning, the Harpers agreed to bring in a child psychologist experienced in working with trauma and very young witnesses. The sessions began within 2 weeks of Leah's disappearance, held in a familiar setting to keep Eli at ease. The therapist encouraged play-based conversation, watching for details that might surface in drawings, storytelling, or pretend games. Slowly, fragments began to emerge, not in clear answers, but in small, almost accidental mentions. He referred once to the quiet man, a phrase he said without fear, but with a kind of certainty, as if it were a name. On another day, he spoke of a door that whispered, something the psychologist interpreted as either the sound of it opening slowly or perhaps creaking in the dark. Neither detail was enough to build a timeline or a suspect profile. Both could have been influenced by overheard adult conversations, dreams, or even something from a cartoon. The problem with preschool memories, investigators knew, was that they could be vivid yet unreliable. Eli's mind was still developing the ability to place events in sequence, to separate reality from imagination. Still, detectives logged every word he said, no matter how abstract, hoping one day they might make sense against a larger puzzle. Weeks turned into months. The psychologist reported no signs that Eli was fabricating stories intentionally, but also no strong indicators that his memories could be trusted as factual. In one session, he insisted Leah had sung him a song before the quiet man came, then later said he had been dreaming. On another occasion, he claimed the man had been outside his window, only to say moments later that he was inside the house. Each contradiction frustrated investigators, but they reminded themselves that this was exactly why eyewitness accounts from young children were so fragile in court. As winter gave way to spring, the lack of tangible leads weighed heavily on the case. The initial frenzy of interviews, searches, and tip calls had slowed to a crawl. The dark van remained untraced. The pry marks on the back door still meant nothing definitive. Leah's phone offered no new clues, and now the one potential witness, a child who might have seen her last moments, couldn't give them a story they could hold on to without it falling apart in their hands. The Harpers did their best to shield Eli from the investigation's emotional toll, but they could not shield themselves from the gnawing realization that without a break, Leah's case was drifting toward the cold case shelf. Every so often, Marissa would notice Eli repeating a line in his play, something about a door or a man, and wonder if she was hearing the truth in disguise. But the more time passed, the harder it became to tell whether these were genuine fragments of memory or the natural storytelling of a child who had overheard too much. And with each passing week, the window to know for certain closed just a little more, leaving the investigation suspended in a fog where fact and fiction were impossible to separate. By the first anniversary of Leah Morgan's disappearance, the Harper home no longer felt like the same place. Daniel and Marissa still lived there, still tucked Eli into the same bedroom where Leah had last read him a story, but the atmosphere was changed, quieter, heavier. Every time the front door creaked, Marissa's chest tightened in reflex, as though some part of her still half expected Leah to walk in. The unanswered questions had worn them down in different ways. Daniel had grown quieter, speaking only when necessary, while Marissa had thrown herself into community outreach, determined to keep Leah's name from slipping into the past tense. Leah's parents, Sandra and Tom Morgan, refused to let the anniversary pass quietly. They organized a candlelight vigil in the town square, inviting neighbors, local press, and anyone willing to stand in the cold with a photo of their daughter. Dozens came, many holding candles, others carrying signs that read, "Help bring Leah home." Sandra spoke briefly, her voice breaking only once, pleading for anyone with even the smallest detail to come forward. Tom, standing beside her, scanned the crowd as if searching for someone he recognized, though his eyes never settled on a single face for long. In the months leading up to the vigil, Leah's case had found a second life online. A true crime forum with thousands of members had picked it up, dissecting every known fact and timeline from that October night. They posted maps of the neighborhood, annotated with the locations of security cameras, and debated the meaning of the faint pry marks on the back door. Some threads focused on the grainy footage of the dark van, analyzing every frame for possible lettering or dents. Others speculated about suspects, neighbors, delivery drivers, even strangers seen in the area in the weeks before. Most of it was conjecture, but it kept the case alive in ways official channels no longer could. A local podcaster known for covering unsolved disappearances reached out to the Harpers for an interview. At first, they hesitated, unsure about inviting more public scrutiny, but eventually agreed. The episode aired in late summer and quickly drew attention, both locally and from listeners in other states. For a short time, tips trickled in again. Some claimed to have seen the van months earlier in other neighborhoods. Others thought they might have recognized Leah from a distance. None of the leads survived even the first round of police verification. Detectives used the renewed attention as an opportunity to revisit old ground. They went back to the neighbors, knocking on the same doors they had a year before. People were polite, but mostly repeated their original statements. Some admitted they had thought about that night many times, wondering if they had missed something. An odd sound, a car engine, a figure at the edge of the street, but no one could give them anything concrete. Even the hardware store camera that had captured the van was gone, replaced months earlier with a higher resolution system. The original footage had already been archived and examined to exhaustion. Despite all the work, the same piece of evidence still hung over the case like an unfinished sentence. The van. It was the one element that felt out of place, a detail too specific to ignore yet too vague to pursue. Detectives had compared it against every reported van theft, every local business with a similar vehicle, every traffic camera within a 10-mile radius. They came up empty each time. The driver remained an invisible presence in the story, someone who might know everything or nothing at all. By the time the anniversary ended, the surge in attention had already begun to fade. The Harpers and the Morgans returned to their separate homes, each family carrying the same quiet burden they had been living with for 12 months. For them, nothing about the case felt old or cold. It was still an open wound. But outside their circle, Leah's story was becoming another headline that people vaguely remembered, but could no longer place. And somewhere, the person or the set of circumstances that had taken her from that house remained hidden, unshaken by the passing of time. 2 years had passed since Leah Morgan vanished from the Harper home, and for most people outside the family, her case had quietly faded into the long list of local mysteries without resolution. The Harpers rarely spoke about that night anymore, at least not in public. Eli was 5 now, starting kindergarten, and Daniel and Marissa had worked hard to give him as normal a childhood as possible. They didn't talk about Leah in front of him beyond the occasional passing mention, and even then, it was in the lightest, most careful terms, a babysitter he used to have, someone who was kind to him. In their minds, he had been too young to remember much, and that was a mercy. But in late September, a call from Eli's kindergarten teacher would change everything. It was a warm afternoon, and during nap time, most of the children lay quietly on their mats while soft music played in the background. The teacher, moving from desk to desk, overheard Eli speaking in a low voice, almost to himself. At first, she thought he was reciting a story, but the words didn't match any book they'd been reading. She froze when she heard him whisper, clear enough to make out every syllable. "Don't go in there. Please." The tone was wrong for a child. It carried urgency, a pleading edge, and something else, something that made the teacher's skin prickle. She knelt beside him and asked where he'd heard that. Eli hesitated, then said softly, "Leah told me that night." There was no hesitation in his voice, no sense that he was guessing. It was a statement, as matter of fact as telling someone his favorite color. The teacher didn't push for more but felt unsettled enough to call Marissa that afternoon. When Marissa arrived to pick Eli up, the teacher relayed exactly what she'd heard. At first, Marissa assumed Eli had overheard her or Daniel talking and was repeating it. But the teacher insisted she had never heard those words before, in or out of class, and Eli's delivery had been almost like he was recalling it in real time. On the drive home, Marissa asked her son about it. Eli repeated the sentence exactly as before, the same pause, the same tone. When she asked again who said it, his answer didn't change. Leah, the night she went away. That night, Marissa told Daniel, and they both sat in silence for several minutes before deciding they couldn't ignore it. 2 days later, they contacted the lead detective who had handled Leah's case. The moment he heard the words, his demeanor shifted. He knew children often mixed memories and imagination, especially after years had passed, but the phrasing was striking. It was direct, specific, and had the cadence of a real moment, not a made-up story. The following week, investigators arranged to speak with Eli in a controlled setting. A forensic child interviewer, trained to avoid leading questions, asked him to talk about the night Leah disappeared. Eli's answers were simple but consistent. He said he'd been in bed, and Leah had been in his room. She'd told him not to get up, not to follow her, and she'd said, "Don't go in there, please." When asked what "there" meant, Eli shrugged. Sometimes he said, "the kitchen," other times, "the back door," as if the memory was anchored to a feeling rather than a location. What struck the interviewer was how certain Eli seemed about the emotion behind her words. He said Leah had been scared, but not of him. She had been talking to someone else, but she'd turned her head toward him when she spoke. In his mind, she was telling him to stay where he was because something bad was near. He couldn't remember hearing anything after that, only that she left the room, and then it was quiet again. When detectives revisited the original timeline with this new piece of information, it forced them to reconsider their assumptions. If Leah had been in Eli's room moments before she vanished, speaking to him in such a way, it suggested she was aware of a threat, possibly even interacting with the person responsible. The words carried a protective tone, as though she was shielding Eli from what was about to happen. The case was reopened with fresh urgency. Officers returned to the Harper home to walk through the layout again, imagining Leah's movements that night. From Eli's bedroom, the back door was only a short hallway away. If someone had entered through that door or was already inside, Leah could have intercepted them within seconds. The faint pry marks on the back door, once dismissed as possibly old, took on new weight. So did the missing shoes. It became plausible that she had slipped them on quickly before stepping out to confront or follow someone, never expecting not to return. The information was enough to reignite media interest. Local news ran the headline, "Toddler's Memory Revives Missing Babysitter Case." Leah's parents were interviewed again, visibly shaken but cautiously hopeful. Sandra Morgan said she believed her daughter's last thoughts were of protecting Eli, even in the face of danger. Still, investigators were careful not to overstate the significance. Children's memories can be fragile, prone to distortion, and 2 years was a long time for a recollection to remain untouched by outside influence. Yet the phrasing, so precise, so consistent, was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Even more unsettling was the possibility that Eli had been awake for more of that night than anyone had realized, quietly listening from his bed as something unfolded just beyond his doorway. As detectives reviewed the case files late into the night, one fact became clear. If Leah had spoken those words to Eli, then she likely knew she was walking into something dangerous. And if she knew, it meant the person or situation she was facing might have been familiar to her. The realization narrowed the possibilities, but also deepened the mystery. Whoever she saw in those final moments had left no trace, no forced entry, no struggle, no sound loud enough for a neighbor to notice. It was as if the danger had slipped in and out under the cover of silence, leaving only a child's memory to mark its passage. And now, 2 years later, that memory had become the most important clue they had. It was also the most fragile. When the recording of Eli's statement reached the hands of a forensic psychologist specializing in delayed childhood recollections, the initial skepticism faded into something more measured. The phrasing was too deliberate to ignore, the delivery too consistent across multiple retellings. It wasn't proof, not in a legal sense, but it was enough to suggest this could be a genuine memory resurfacing now that Eli's language skills had matured. At 3 years old, his understanding of events would have been limited, but at 5, the fragments of that night could finally find words. The psychologist explained that such memories often remain dormant until the child's cognitive development allows for expression, and when they emerge, they can retain striking clarity in specific sensory or emotional details. Armed with this perspective, detectives decided it was time to go back, not to the files or the photographs, but to the physical scene itself. 2 years had passed. The Harper home had been cleaned, repainted in places, even remodeled slightly. But certain aspects of a house don't change. The placement of doors, the line of sight from a bedroom to a hallway, the sound a particular hinge makes when it moves. Detectives walked the space slowly, trying to reconstruct Leah's possible path after she told Eli those words. From the boys' room, the back door was just beyond the kitchen, and to get there, she would have had to pass within feet of it. If someone was already inside or standing at that door, Leah could have intercepted them in seconds. One theory began to take shape. Perhaps Leah had heard something, footsteps, a knock, a creak, that drew her from Eli's room. Maybe she told him to stay put because she was about to confront the source of the noise. If she knew the person, it could explain the absence of forced entry and the fact that no neighbors heard shouting or signs of a struggle. It might also explain why she left her phone charging on the counter. If she expected to be back within moments, she wouldn't have felt the need to take it. The missing shoes could mean she slipped them on quickly in response to whatever she heard. But another angle troubled them more. What if she wasn't just keeping Eli in his bed? What if she was physically shielding him from someone already in the house? The psychologist noted that in situations where a child's safety is threatened, caregivers often place themselves between the child and the perceived danger. That raised a chilling possibility. Leah's last words might not have been about the kitchen or the back door at all. They could have been about Eli's own bedroom. "Don't go in there," could have been directed toward an intruder, buying her a few seconds to lead them away from the boy. To test these possibilities, investigators began revisiting every aspect of the Harper family's circle: friends, relatives, neighbors, co-workers. They compiled a list of anyone who had known the babysitting schedule, even casually. Leah's shifts weren't advertised, but in a small town, routines have a way of becoming public knowledge. Someone who wanted to avoid the Harpers might have known the parents would be out that night. Someone who wanted Leah specifically might have known exactly when she'd be alone with Eli. The interviews were polite but probing. Former co-workers of Daniel's were asked where they had been that night. Marissa's friends were quietly questioned about whether anyone had expressed unusual interest in Leah. Even neighbors who had given statements 2 years earlier were asked to recall small details again: who was parked on the street, whether any porch lights were off that were normally on, if anyone's routine seemed out of place. Many couldn't remember, or their answers contradicted earlier statements, a natural side effect of time and the brain's tendency to rewrite vague memories. Detectives also re-examined the known physical evidence with this new lens. The faint pry marks on the back door, dismissed at the time as possibly old, were now reanalyzed by a newer forensic imaging process, though results remained inconclusive. The footage of the dark van was slowed, filtered, and enhanced using updated software, but the grain was still too heavy to pull a plate number. What did shift was the emotional tone inside the department. The case no longer felt like a cold, dead file. It was breathing again, however faintly. And the small detail of a child's words had forced everyone to look at the crime not as a random vanishing, but as a series of intentional movements inside a very specific space. Someone had entered that house, and Leah had reacted in a way that suggested she knew them, or at least wasn't initially afraid to face them. The narrowing of focus came with its own risks. If the person responsible was within the Harpers' extended circle, it meant they had likely remained nearby all this time, aware of every anniversary, every news segment, every vigil. That possibility unsettled the Harpers more than they admitted publicly. Marissa found herself rethinking casual conversations at school pickup, while Daniel kept mental tallies of neighbors who seemed too interested or too disinterested when Leah's name came up. By the time detectives wrapped their walkthrough of the Harper home, they had a clearer picture of what might have happened in those final minutes, but no closer grip on who had caused them. The reconstruction raised more questions than answers. Was Leah lured to the back door or intercepted in the hallway? Did she leave to protect Eli, or because she thought she could handle the situation? And if the person was someone she knew, why had they vanished into the night without a trace? Those questions, paired with the growing unease that the person could still be among them, became the undercurrent of the reopened investigation. And for the first time in 2 years, the Harpers and the Morgans felt the possibility that somewhere in those overlooked details lay the thread that could finally unravel the truth. But if that thread existed, it had been hidden carefully, perhaps by someone who had been watching them all along. 2 months into the reopened investigation, when momentum was beginning to thin and leads were once again turning into loops, a call came in from a detective in a neighboring county. His voice carried a mix of curiosity and caution. He had a case on his desk from 3 years earlier that sounded uncomfortably familiar. In his files was the disappearance of 19-year-old Claire Denning, a part-time college student who had been babysitting for a local family one November night. The details were unnerving in their symmetry. The child left unharmed in bed, the babysitter gone without trace, and a neighbor's vague account of seeing a dark van idling nearby not long before she vanished. The more investigators compared the two cases, the more the parallels stood out. Both victims were young women with no known enemies. Both disappeared during a shift for families they knew well, and in both cases, there were no signs of forced entry or a violent struggle. Each had a narrow window of disappearance, less than 90 minutes between the last confirmed contact and the time the parents returned home. In Claire's case, her phone was also left behind, charging on the kitchen counter. Detectives began mapping out the similarities on a shared timeline board, marking each event in red for Leah and blue for Claire. The overlaps were striking enough to suggest more than coincidence, but they were also just vague enough to resist formal linkage. There was no DNA in either case, no fingerprints that didn't belong to residents, and no clear image of the van that could be definitively matched. In Claire's case, the van had been reported by a single witness, a man walking his dog who couldn't remember the make or plate, only that it was dark-colored and older. The shared details breathed new urgency into Leah's case. Investigators in both counties agreed to form a joint task group to re-examine each disappearance side by side. They hoped that by comparing witness statements, rechecking forensic reports, and cross-referencing possible suspects, something would shake loose. Within weeks, a name began to emerge, a man who had been a handyman in both areas around the time of the vanishings. He had done odd jobs for multiple families in each town, including minor repairs for the neighbors of both babysitting households. His background didn't inspire confidence. He had a history of burglary charges in his 20s, a restraining order filed against him a decade ago, and several petty theft arrests. More recently, he had been questioned in unrelated break-ins but never charged. Most compelling was the fact that his work truck had broken down several years back, and witnesses in other cases had seen him borrowing a dark van from an acquaintance for work errands. Detectives started quietly piecing together his movements during the weeks surrounding each disappearance. Records showed he had no official alibi for either night, but without GPS, receipts, or confirmed sightings, placing him at the exact location of either crime was impossible. Still, the circumstantial web was tightening, and both investigative teams were preparing to bring him in for formal questioning. Then, the call came that none of them expected. He was dead. A sudden single-vehicle accident on a rural road, no passengers, no witnesses. The official report described it as a likely loss of control in wet conditions, but for the detectives who had been circling him, the timing felt like a punch to the gut. Whatever he knew, whatever questions he might have answered, were now sealed off forever. The frustration in both departments was palpable. They combed through his belongings, hoping for some note, some keepsake, something that would connect him to either girl. What they found was maddeningly incomplete. Tools, unpaid bills, a scattering of photographs of job sites, but nothing that placed him directly in the Harpers' home or the Denning residence. Even the van he had once borrowed was long gone, sold to an unknown buyer years earlier, with no traceable bill of sale. For Leah's parents, and for Sandra and Tom Morgan, the news was a fresh wound. For Claire's family, it was a reopening of an old one. The possibility that the same person had taken both young women was chilling, but with no proof. It was still just a shadow of an answer, and in the absence of evidence, the official record couldn't link the cases. They remained separate entries in separate counties, similar in method, separated by time, joined only by suspicion. Still, the joint investigation wasn't ready to walk away entirely. Detectives noticed another uncomfortable detail in both cases. In the weeks leading up to the disappearances, each victim had mentioned in passing that someone had been around the neighborhood asking about handyman work or looking for side jobs. Neither comment had seemed important at the time, but in hindsight, they carried a weight that was hard to ignore. If the same person had been canvassing both areas, it meant he had been methodically selecting opportunities, perhaps watching patterns, learning which homes would be occupied and by whom. The working theory, whispered more than written, was that he might have chosen babysitters because they were young, isolated in unfamiliar homes and unlikely to expect trouble. But without living suspects to test that theory against, it remained an unprovable thread. In the Harper home, the reemergence of the van as a possible connection brought back all the old fears. Daniel found himself lingering at windows after dark, scanning the street for parked vehicles. Marissa checked the locks more than once before bed, even on nights when Eli was staying at her sister's. For Leah's parents, the knowledge that another family had lived their nightmare made the world feel smaller, more dangerous, as if the line between random tragedy and targeted crime was thinner than they had ever believed. By the end of the year, the joint task group quietly dissolved. The files were updated, cross-referenced, and stored back on separate shelves. There would be no arrest, no confession, no closure. What they had left was a set of circumstantial similarities strong enough to haunt everyone involved, but too weak to stand in court. For the families, the collapse of the lead was worse than having no lead at all. It had dangled the possibility of an answer, an explanation that might connect all the fragments of that night, and then yanked it away. And somewhere, the image of a dark van idling on a quiet street continued to cast its shadow over both towns, a reminder that someone had once been there, watching, waiting, and then disappearing just as completely as the girls themselves. Even after the surge of renewed attention, the interviews, the re-examination of the Harper home, and the unsettling connection to another unsolved case, Leah Morgan's disappearance was still no closer to resolution. The momentum that had briefly returned began to slow again, and the quiet weight of uncertainty settled back over the Harpers and the Morgans like it had never left. What remained, more than any piece of evidence or forensic report, were the words that had brought the investigation back to life in the first place. Words spoken by a child who was now old enough to understand that people were listening to him, but not old enough to grasp the full impact of what he was saying. Eli's recitation of Leah's last sentence, "Don't go in there, please," hadn't been a one-time event. Over the months that followed, he would say it again, sometimes during play, sometimes when his parents least expected it. Once, while helping Daniel carry groceries into the kitchen, he paused by the doorway and murmured it under his breath, as though the air in that spot still held her voice. Another time, he whispered it to himself while drawing at the dining table, his crayon sketch showing a small figure standing between a larger one and a closed door. The Harpers began to notice that these moments often came with small additions, tiny fragments of memory, perhaps, or inventions of a child who had lived too long with a mystery. He would mention the quiet man, a description that never changed but never grew more detailed. Sometimes he said the man was near the back door. Other times, he claimed the man was in the hall or by the stairs. When Marissa gently pressed for more, Eli would either grow silent or change the subject, as if a wall went up in his mind. For investigators, these variations were both intriguing and frustrating. The forensic psychologist explained that children's memories often work like a series of snapshots rather than a continuous film. Emotional moments are stored, but the surrounding context can blur or be replaced by later imaginings. The difficulty was determining whether Eli was recalling separate images from the same night or unconsciously filling in gaps with pieces from other memories. Without a way to confirm either, the statements could not be treated as evidence, at least not in a court of law. Still, detectives kept them in the file. They had learned long ago that even the smallest, most unlikely fragment could find its place in the puzzle if the right piece emerged later. But as the second anniversary of Eli's unexpected disclosure came and went, no such piece appeared. The list of active leads had dwindled to nothing. Every person of interest had been interviewed or cleared, every scrap of potential physical evidence analyzed, every timeline triple-checked. The case remained open on paper, but in practice it was once again frozen. For the Harpers, the lack of progress was complicated by the fact that Eli's memories were no longer a private matter. The media attention following the reopening of the case had made him a figure in the public imagination, the silent witness who might one day provide the breakthrough. Some online forums picked apart every reported detail of his words, debating their meaning and whether they were trustworthy. Most of the speculation was baseless, but some of it made its way back to Marissa, who had begun to guard Eli's privacy more fiercely than ever. She stopped discussing the case outside of formal interviews, refusing even to confirm whether he had said anything new. And yet, within the walls of their home, the words never truly left. Daniel described them as a presence, always there, lingering in the background of their lives. The sentence had become both a clue and a curse. If it was real, It was the closest anyone had come to knowing Leah's final moments. If it was not, then it was a phantom they could never lay to rest. In either case, it meant that for as long as Eli remembered, they would all be tethered to that night. Leah's parents carried that same burden, though in a different way. For Sandra and Tom Morgan, Eli's words were a thin thread of connection to their daughter, but also a tormenting reminder of how close she had been to safety. If she had time to speak to the boy, then she had time to act, time to fight, to run, to escape. The fact that she hadn't or couldn't was a thought that kept Sandra awake in the early hours, replaying scenarios over and over in her mind. Detectives, too, admitted privately that the sentence had lodged itself into their thinking. It was simple, but it implied a sequence of events, a moment of recognition and choice. Leah had known something, or someone, was on the other side of that there, and her instinct had been to warn Eli away from it. It was protective, deliberate, and perhaps even resigned. And it suggested that whatever she faced, she hadn't been able to stop it. In quiet moments, Marissa found herself listening for echoes of that tone in Eli's voice, as if the way he said the words might reveal more than the words themselves. Once, while tucking him in, she asked if Leah had been looking at him when she spoke. Eli nodded but didn't elaborate. Another time, he said she was looking past him toward the door. These shifts in detail were small, but they left Marissa wondering if her son was holding back, whether consciously or not. The investigators assigned to the cold case admitted among themselves that the truth might never be known. Without new evidence, without a confession, without the emergence of a credible witness, the case would remain where it had been for years, open but stagnant, catalogued alongside dozens of other missing person files, gathering dust in a climate-controlled archive. Every so often, they would revisit it, check for new matches in databases, compare it to new cases for patterns. But those check-ins grew less frequent as months passed without change. In the Harper household, life went on because it had to. Eli started playing soccer, made friends at school, and began to talk less about Leah without being prompted. But every once in a while, the words would return, unbidden, and freeze the air in the room. Sometimes it was in the middle of a game, sometimes while helping set the table, sometimes as he was falling asleep. Always the same phrase, in the same soft tone, spoken as if to someone who was no longer there. "Don't go in there, please." No one could say for certain whether those words were a direct memory of Leah's final moments or a reconstruction built from years of hearing about her disappearance. But for the Harpers, for the Morgans, and for the detectives who had chased the truth and come up empty, it didn't matter. The sentence was a reminder that somewhere, out in the quiet of that October night, Leah had faced something that stole her away without leaving a single trace. 2 years after Eli first spoke the words, the file still sat on the cold case shelf, its edges worn from handling, its contents unchanged. And in a quiet suburban home, a child still carried the last known voice of a missing girl, unaware that in repeating it, he was keeping alive both the mystery and the ache of everything that had been lost.